We're on? Okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Oh. Uh-oh. Now you've done it. All right. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Kristen Lindquist.
Who's the man playing with the shades?
Pay no attention. Pay no attention.
Ignore me. Ignore me. I'm here to clean up after.
Don't touch me. I'm Kristen Lindquist, board member of Monhegan Associates and a member of the Ecology Committee. Tonight's lecture will be recorded and, if all goes well, posted on the Monhegan Associates website by Jim here within the next few days. So a big thank you to the Monhegan Associates for sponsoring this lecture series every summer. We have 4 talks. Big thank you to the Ecology Committee for coordinating the 4 talks, to Jim Galvin for recording the lectures so we can share it with people who couldn't be here in person. And a big thank you to all of you for attending on this gorgeous night. And you could be out watching the sunset. We're going to be doing this instead. Your donations and your support help make this kind of thing possible, as well as keeping the trails open and beautiful so we can all get out there and hike on them. If you couldn't donate tonight, or even if you could and you think you want to become a member of the Monhegan Associates, there are membership envelopes there, and you can also go online and do donations and become a member online. All right, our next 2 lectures, I'm going to tell you now instead of at the end, so I remember. Next Thursday, August 1st. Next Thursday?
We skip a week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Phew, I was like, wait a minute, next Thursday's August 1st. Phew, I lost a week of my life. Okay, 2 Thursdays from now, thankfully. August 1st, David Foster is, he's an ecologist who's going to talk about the forest. And August 8th, Shelby Perry, another ecologist, wildlands ecologist at Northeast Wilderness Trust, will be speaking. So, but this week, we have Brett. Brett Ewald has been studying and enjoying birds and nature for over 40 years, specializing in migration and distribution patterns. He spent 10 years conducting migration research for Braddock Bay raptor research along the shores of Lake Ontario, including directing the Hamlin Beach Lake Watch and co-authoring a publication on waterbird movements. He was the guide and owner of Lakeshore Nature Tours, sharing the joys of birding at premier locations throughout North America, including, of course, Monhegan, which is where I met him. Brett is currently the director of New Jersey Audubon's Cape May Bird Observatory, and he shares his favorite moments with his wife Cheryl and Nia Bay, a treeing walker coonhound. So, welcome, Brett.
Welcome, everybody. Come on in. Plenty of room.
Well, we're glad you made it.
Yes.
Yes, we are. Like talk?
Sure. That works for everybody, right?
Yep.
And those shades are perfect now, right?
Yes.
Good deal. Jim, am I good?
You're good.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank Kristen and Nan and Sally for making this all happen and welcoming us into your home this evening. So that was wonderful. My personal Monhegan story started back in 2001 when my wife and I came here for a day trip, 4 hours on the island. That's all it took. We were quickly caught in Monhegan's trap, and so have been coming back many a time over many years since. Migrant trap, exactly. So, lobster. There's a lot of trap things associated with Monhegan, but we ended up bringing a lot of groups out here, and over the years, along came this publication, which I'm hoping to share with you tonight. So, a couple things. I really want to illustrate and get the point across to all of you. How many of you are birders here? First off. Okay, good. I'm in good company. How many of you bird on Monhegan? A fair amount. Okay, a few. That's great. Well, for those who have never been, I really hope to share just how special Monhegan is. And for those who already enjoyed out here, I hope I can at least expand upon your appreciation, because Monhegan really does stand head and shoulders above a lot of other places in eastern North America in terms of the birds that you can see. So, for a couple of reasons. One, it's a long history. So we can go back to the known birding history all the way to 1605 with the Weymouth expedition, when James Rozier came ashore and realized that there was all kinds of diverse fowl nesting on the cliffs, and they found large eggshells around the remnants of obvious Native American fire that had been built out here. Those eggshells are most likely what is now extinct and has been for a long time, a gray auk. So it would be incredible to have that confirmed as a record for Monhegan. So that just showed you how far back it goes. Also, its diversity. So just since I published the book last fall, 2 more species, Hammond's flycatcher and mountain bluebird, have been added to the record of birds seen on Monhegan, bringing it up to 338 species. That's almost as many as some states. And you're talking about just a little, bit of an island here. So that just, again, tells you how special it is. But it's not just the history and the diversity. It's also the abundance. There are many species that have been recorded in incredible numbers out here, from hundreds to thousands of them in a single day. And that's another thing that really inspires birders. We love to go out and see just the trees dripping with birds, and this is one of those places, spring and fall. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is based around spring and fall migration, which is when Monhegan really shines. And there's nothing better to have a fall out and birds everywhere around you. And it's not just the abundance, it's also the rarity. So for Monhegan, there have been 16 species whose first record for Maine happened on Monhegan. And there are another 5 of those species have only ever been seen on Monhegan and nowhere else in Maine. So that's Hammond's flycatcher, gray flycatcher, shiny cowbird, Cassin's vireo. Which one am I forgetting? Virginia's warbird, probably the most notable one out of all of them, and I'll share a little more of that story later on. I could speak for hours. I'm not going to do that tonight, so don't worry about that. But I could and still not cover everything that Monhegan means to birding. But I want you to leave here tonight with maybe just a little better picture of what that is, and hopefully you'll take that with you and appreciate birds and nature wherever you go. So let's hit the slides and we'll get right into it. I got a lot of slides. Hopefully it'll be a visual treat for you tonight. You might say, why Monhegan? I mean, really, why does this island off the coast of Maine, why is it so great for birds? Well, there's probably 3 main reasons. One, its location. So it's far enough off the coast that it's not just amongst all the other islands that are more inshore. So it's isolated. And it's along what is a migration flyway. So the east coast of the U.S. is a main migration flyway. It's isolated enough off that birds that get blown off course end up out over the water and need to rest and refuel after potentially traveling hundreds of miles in a night. This is where they're going to show up. So location. Location's always critical. You can see from the... Oh, not yet. Well, you don't need to go back. But that little boundary kind of around that I had on the map, that's the Monhegan Island Lobster Conservation Area. That's what the boundary I used for the book to accept records as being from Monhegan. So it's just within that. And that varies from about 2.5 miles to 3 miles off the coast of the island. So that's what that little boundary was. So, second reason why Monhegan. Diverse habitats in a small space. So you've got something that's going to attract a lot of different kinds of birds, whether it's fresh water, ice pond, meadow, whether it's forested areas, which you can see cover much of the island, even urban areas. So there are a fair number of birds that are very used to urban areas and will settle into those areas. So European starlings, for example, which you might see around town quite a bit. So having those various habitats within that small area, regardless of what species, when they end up on the island, they're likely to be able to settle into one area and get food, shelter, and survive for a couple days until conditions might be better to move on. So with migration, weather is critical for these birds. They migrate under the most conducive conditions. They halt migration when the conditions are bad, or if they don't have enough resources to continue on. So in other words, many bird species almost double their weight before the long distance migrants before heading out on migration. If they end up using more than they thought, they need to replenish before they're going to travel further on. And I wasn't going to, but I'm going to insert a little story here about a certain species that you get out here on Monhegan that just really shows how important spots like this are, and that's the black-polled warbler. It's a boreal species, so it nests all across Canada, northern Canada, and goes up into like Alaska. Most of that population, instead of just heading straight south for the winter, actually moved to the east coast and then head from the east coast out over the water in a southeast direction. So counterintuitive to what we would think a small, they're only about that big, warbler would do. And they head out there until they hit the trade winds, which take them back to the southwest, to the Caribbean, and on to South America. They basically do a 3-day non-stop flight for a little bird that just weighs a couple ounces. If they have not almost doubled their weight, they won't survive. If they hit a bad storm, they probably won't survive. They need to be able to fly non-stop 3 days straight just to get to land that will then have water and food for them to refuel. So that's the migration strategy that works for that species. But a place like Monhegan, and we see a fair number of black-polled warblers some years in the fall, is critical. They'll show up here, spend a few days feeding, and then they'll continue on. So hopefully this fall, you'll see a black-polled warbler out here, and you'll think, that bird is amazing. So,
I have a question.
yeah.
Do they fly like through the night, like nonstop?
So yes, they will. And I'll quickly go over migration strategy for songbirds. So different groups of birds migrate at different times. Like a lot of waterfowl will migrate in the day. Raptors migrate in the day because they use warm rising air, soaring to gain altitude and then glide and gain altitude, glide. Songbirds migrate mostly at night for 3 main reasons. One, it's cooler. So imagine if you were running and you had to run all that distance. Would you rather do it at night when it's cool or when it's 90 degrees out in the daytime? Their bodies would overheat if they were migrating hundreds of miles during the daytime. So that's one thing. Winds are usually less, so it's more still air for them to fly in. So that's another survival strategy. They will use some species, the stars, things like that, to use as migrating aids. So there's a number of reasons that songbirds like to migrate at night. But then they usually will migrate maybe a couple hundred miles, and then when it gets light, or before it even gets light, they'll put down and they'll be looking for food and a place to rest during the day until the next night. Then the story starts again. If it's bad weather, they may not. That's why often if you get a great number of birds dropping onto Monhegan, they may be here for 2 or 3 days, which is what birders love, because it gives you a great chance to get out and see a lot of them and sort through all the more common ones to find those rarer birds. So yes, so they'll fly all night, but then when it gets morning, and the other thing is they don't want to be flying when all the raptors are out in the daytime, because the raptors are going to like nothing better than to go after, and some of you out here may have seen merlins, like Jim and I were talking about chasing, or you and I were talking about chasing after songbirds and stuff. So that's just one of the reasons. So, yep, and you can hear them at night. So they will actually have different flight calls at night than they use in the daytime. And they use them to, a lot of birds of a certain species may move, not necessarily in a flock, but under the same conditions the same time of year. And they will make these little notes, and it actually alerts them to other birds that are out there migrating. My wife and I were in Bath a number of years ago on our way out to come out, and Lita grew up to Monhegan, and we came out from dinner, and it was like 9:30 at night, and it was foggy. So the birds don't necessarily like flying through the fog. But all we kept hearing was veery call notes. Veery is a thrush, all over the place. It was really wonderful, because we just hear them as they were passing ahead. The fog had made them fly lower. They were probably looking for places to put down, but it seemed like they were just, and most of the time, you may not hear that if they're up too high and that sort of thing. So I hope that answers your question. And the third reason for why Monhegan, accessibility. Where else can you go on a spot like this that is so good for all these birds and have the accessibility you do? Monhegan Associates and the trails that they maintain are wonderful for that. Even the roads through town and stuff, some of the great birding happens right in all the trees right along the town. So much of the island is accessible to track down a lot of those birds that come out here. So I mentioned weather. So what you see on any given day may vary greatly. One day can be great. The next day there may not be much around. That's all just part of the fun of birding. So you never really know what you're going to run into. And also it's going to depend on how serious are you about really wanting to see everything. How much of this island are you going to try and cover in one day and stuff. Some of the people that would come on my tours, oh, we're going to a small island and we're just going to kind of leisurely bird all day. And then at the end of the day, and we've covered 9 miles, they're like, man, my legs are tired, because you really want to see a lot of stuff. So let's move on. And so I talked a little bit about the history, and I'm going to share a little bit more with you. It really became known as a birding destination in the late 1800s, and by the early 1900s, it was actually known as a birding destination. It's hard to believe back then it was more known as an artist colony, but the birders were coming out. And this is a photo from 1917. There's actually 1917 or 1918. There's a little confusion over what the date may be, but this is, we probably look pretty similar if you've seen us birders wandering around in the fall. Not too different from what they were, maybe a little bit different. But there's a couple notable people in this photo I want to point out. Judge Jenny on the left-hand side and Warner Taylor on the right-hand side. So Judge Jenny was responsible for, there's a little publication that the library puts out called The Birds of Monhegan, a fall migration census, and he was responsible for gathering that data that was originally used to publish that in Maynard's A Walk in Nature back in 1918. That was published. And then Warner Taylor, so Tish is in here tonight, but Lily, her sister, and Henry were very helpful in getting me historical information. Warner was a birder on the island from roughly about 1914 up to early 1950s. So had a lot of sightings, and she shared original checklists, just wonderful information to have on some of the early birding records for the island. So, yeah, I think we can head on to the next slide.
Why does it look like the woman on the left has wings on her head?
So interesting thing. So this is, it looks great, but it's not necessarily a good thing. So back in the Victorian times and into the early 1900s, the millinery trade, bird feathers was huge in fashion. Wearing bird feathers was huge. And so a lot of herons and egrets and those with flashy plumes were hunted to near extinction to get those feathers for fashion. So it was the halting of that trade, along with some other steps they took around that same time, that really helped a lot of species to recover. A lot of bird populations right around the turn of the century up until about 1910, 1915 were in serious decline. And then some steps were taken, and market hunting was stopped for certain groups. So ducks is one example where populations had totally crashed. Now with Ducks Unlimited and all they've done, their populations are doing great, where a lot of other songbirds, raptors are declining. The waterfowl is still doing great. So it shows that if we put our mind to it and some resources, we can help to turn things around. But we have to realize what is happening, and then it takes the steps to do it. So, yeah, and here's that little publication I was talking about. Nan, I think you'll notice grandmother did the cover design for that publication put out by the library. So a lot of great ties here with the community and the birding on Monhegan. So let's move on, Jim. So Hog Island Audubon Camp was started in 1936, not too far from here. So they have been taking advantage of Monhegan's birds for that long. Early well-known birders like Roger Torrey Peterson was bringing groups out to the island. Here's actually a group around 1938 down at Lobster Cove birding. Jim? And here's another shot from about 1941 of Alan Cruikshank teaching the Monhegan Audubon Club, so teaching some youngsters about birds. And he would have come over from Hog Island, and I brought a group up, was over here teaching some of the kids. So maybe Sally, you can help me figure out who some of those kids were in that in that photo. So, of course, one of the biggest things that changed that really has helped the birds and the birders on Monhegan is the formation of Monhegan Associates in 1954 through the efforts of Theodore Edison and others, and the roughly 2/3 of the island that has been set aside and maintained in its natural, and improved in many cases, its natural state, and the maintaining of the trails. So the birders really have a heavy debt of thanks to Monhegan Associates for making the island what it is. Hit the next slide, Jim. And I just want to point out here, this is a shot from 1907. What don't you notice much of in that picture? Trees. Very few trees. So much of the island was cleared back in the late 1800s and early 1900s for shipbuilding, home building, agriculture. So there were a lot of oxen and sheep brought over, and also the planting of crops. So they literally cleared much of the island. And not too long after realized that livestock wasn't going to work out here, major agriculture was not going to work out here. And by that time, much of the best lumber for shipbuilding and stuff was already gone. So that's what it looked like back then. You saw that Monhegan Associates trail map early on shows just how much of the island is green now, and all you have to do is walk out here to see the difference that's been made. And that's huge, obviously, for the birds. Not that all birds would hate that. Pipits might like it, and a few other birds that like open country and stuff. But the majority of birds much prefer Monhegan as it is today. So go ahead, Jim. And here you can see a nice overhead shot that illustrates, the island, town here, the meadow, and then just how much of the island is still now forested back to what it would have been before it was cleared. So, interesting thing that's happening with the forests out here, and there are some great studies that have been done right on Monhegan, is the aging of some of the white spruce and the red spruce taking over for the white spruce. And the white spruce are the ones that would have first come in, so many of those along the roads and stuff are now reaching the end of their lives and stuff. And it's be interesting to see, how the red spruce progress and what else happens in terms of what trees continue to survive, especially with the climate warming, and what trees are really going to adapt to that and then thrive out here on Monhegan. So, next slide, Jim. Another major step to bring people's attention to Monhegan was the arrival of Tom Martin and his first wife, Irene, back in 1954 as well, and later his second wife, Josephine. And Tom Martin was a very well-known photographer, botanist, and ornithologist, and would take a lot of macro photos of birds and plants and stuff. Next photo. And here's a couple close-ups. He would do these super close-ups. These are both northern flicker, which is a woodpecker, close-up of feather detail. And just look how beautiful they are. And Tom was great at doing this sort of stuff. And you can see a whole display of his works up at the Monhegan Museum, even a few videos of his that they have that you can play. Next slide, Jim. And one of the things that he did, so he started, was taking pictures of the birds around, and he captured this image of a clay-colored sparrow, which this is one of the earliest records known for New England of clay-colored sparrow, and it got the attention of the editors at Audubon Field Notes, and they put it right on the cover. So that put Monhegan's name even, more out there for the birders to hear about. So, Jim. So now let's kind of maybe do like a little bit of a virtual tour, birding tour of Monhegan. And of course, the first thing you need to do for most of us, unless you're lucky enough to live out here, is arrive by boat. So, next slide. As you're arriving, And coming in, if you use that boundary kind of that I put out there for Monhegan's birds, you get within that 2.5 mile border, then sure, we can count it as Monhegan bird. And next slide, Jim. And one of the things you might encounter, you're likely to encounter seabirds, water birds within that habitat. And northern gannet is one of the great birds that a lot of birders love to see. And sometimes spring and fall are in great numbers right off the shore out here. You can see them looking out the windows here. You don't have to be out on a boat. They're big birds, 6-foot wingspan. They plunge dive like pelicans for fish. So very easy to see when they're around, and just a beautiful bird. Next slide. And then you'll also want to pay attention to the little islets that surround Monhegan. Again, it's not just Monhegan. There's Manana, which is giving it the safe harbor that we have here, and it's Nye Duck, it's Eastern Duck Rock, it's the Outer Ducks. And all of these are microclimates, microhabitats that certain birds are going to find attractive. Obviously, if you've come in on the boat, you've noticed all the gulls and cormorants that love those rocks. It's a safe place for them to be. It's also a great spot for them to nest, so you can see lots of those out there. But there's other birds that will use them as well. Next slide, Jim. And sometimes it'll be a nice adult bald eagle. And bald eagles have nested on the island, but what also happens is they nest on some of the islands that are closer to the mainland and then come out here to grab food. Because if you've got lots of young gulls and cormorants and whatever else is around, that's a great food resource for a bald eagle. So you'll often see them perched on the rocks out on those small islands. So next slide, Jim. And here's a shot of Nye Duck and the other ducks out beyond it. Next slide. And of course, as you come in, you'll see Monhegan and then the approach to the safe harbor. Next slide. And then even the harbor itself is its own great little protected area to go birding. Next slide. And one of the things you might see is a black guillemot. So we saw numbers of them. You could probably right now look out the window and maybe see one in close to the shore. So they do nest probably notably on the backside of Manana in little burrows in the rocks and stuff. But you'll see these beautiful adults. Look at the red feet on them. They are just an absolutely beautiful bird that will be diving around here, and those white wing patches. If you come later in the fall, they change their plumage in the winter and they're more gray and white, not that stark black and white that they are now. But you can see them right in the harbor. And just a great bird to welcome people to Monhegan. Next slide, Jim. And then, of course, you arrive at the wharf and you get onto Monhegan, and from there things just get even better. So, and one of the great things is it's always nice to feel welcome when you're birding someplace, and Monhegan has been very welcoming to the birders over the years. Next slide. So I'll take you through a few of the locations that birders often like to go to, and one is the obvious Lighthouse Hill and the lighthouse up top, and we need to give a shout out to the lighthouse, 200 years old this year, 1824 to 2024. Yeah, so that's fantastic. And that's up where the museum is if you want to go see some of Tom Martin's stuff. And just a great resource. I need to thank Jen Pye at the Monhegan Museum for all the help she did, as well with researching and digging out some old photos and checklists from years ago. Next slide. But the view, you get the great view, and anytime you have a great view, you're going to want to be looking for birds. And some of the birds you might see from up on the top, Jim, is raptors passing by. So oftentimes raptors that come to the island are migrating in the day. They may be blown off course from the mainland a little bit, and they might just be cruising over the island and just head right out the south end of it and back towards the mainland. But oftentimes they get on the island and they see all those other birds and food around, and they're like, it's not a bad place to be. I think I'll stay a day or two, and you'll see them patrolling the island, chasing after songbirds and things like this. This is a sharp-shinned hawk that's cruising by. One of our smaller raptors doesn't necessarily look in that photo, but they're a fairly small hawk, a forest hawk. Next slide. Compare that to a turkey vulture, which has got about a 6-foot wingspan, is actually quite rare. There's only been a handful of records of turkey vulture, I think 14 total over the years. Whereas if you go to the mainland, they're much more common, but they don't like water. So they're not likely to get blown off. For one thing, they're a big bird, less likely to get blown off, and they hate water. They don't like cold air, and that's what water is as a source of cold air. So that's actually quite a rare bird out here. So next slide. And you can also see some of the other great habitats from up on Lighthouse Hill, and that's the 9-acre freshwater meadow I was talking about, which again is such an attractant for a wide variety of birds. Next slide. Like the sora. So you're much more likely to hear a sora than you are to see one. They tend to hide in the reeds, and you might hear one calling. So if you hear spring and fall and you hear that, you know there's a sora out there. You probably won't ever see it. Every now and then one will show up at the ice pond, walking the edges, and you get a look at it. Next slide. Or an American bittern that has dropped in. So a member of the heron egret bittern family. Again, most likely to just be seen when they're either dropping in or flying out of the meadow. Next slide. Or this very rare least bittern, which there's only ever been 2 records of on the island. Next slide. Or potentially a shorebird that's dropped in and found the walkway is a good place to look for food, and this is a short-billed dowitcher. Again, a very uncommon migrant at Monhegan, much more likely to be seen on mudflats and stuff along the mainland's coast than it is out here on Monhegan. Next slide. And then, of course, the ice pond. Everybody's got to stop at the ice pond. You better stop at the ice pond at least once a day, because you never know what's going to drop in. It's the best spot to see dabbling ducks. Next slide. Such as this blue-winged teal. Which are just absolutely beautiful. They're showing it, obviously it's what it's named for. Next slide. Or how can you beat a wood duck, a male wood duck? And that and the meadow are the best places to see them. But the ice pond is so open, you can quickly stop by in the morning, stop by later in the day, and see what's there. Next slide. Maybe this much more uncommon yellow-crowned night heron. This is a juvenile yellow-crowned night heron, hence it doesn't have a nice yellow crown. But again, a beautiful but very uncommon bird to be seen out here on the island. Next slide. Or maybe a solitary sandpiper, which is more likely to be seen on that muddy edge towards the back edge of the ice pond. Again, it's all about microhabitats and what these birds need. So that bird's going to be walking through the mud trying to pick out things, food, worms, and other microorganisms out of the mud, along with other shorebirds. You're not going to see them walking down the road necessarily or perched in a tree. They're going to want to be on those mud flats, and there's very few places to look. So when you go to these different locations, okay, I'm looking for ducks here, I'm looking for shorebirds here, I'm looking for warblers here. And just always pay attention, because you never know what's going to be flying by, that raptor zipping by, or that warbler shooting through because a hawk is chasing it. Next slide. And how about a monarch hitching a ride on the mallards? So, yeah, there's a few mallards around that might want a free meal when you go over to the ice pond. Next slide. Then, as I mentioned, the town roads are some of the best places to see a lot of different birds and get close-up looks. There's so much nice habitat right around them that almost every corner can provide something. Next slide. Such as a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And you see that's an apple tree. Every one of those holes in that tree was made by a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And some of those apple trees are so old out here, and there have been so many yellow-bellied sapsuckers over the years that have come through, that you look at it and you say, how can that tree even survive? It's just a mass of holes caused by a bird. And the birds are looking not only for the sap, but the insects that are attracted to the sap. So they'll also eat ants and things like that come in. But again, a beautiful little woodpecker can be fairly common in the fall particularly. But look at those apple trees when you're out here. So, next slide, please. And then, of course, again, microhabitats. You've got fish beach and swim beach. Maybe a little busy today for sure for birds to show up on. A lot of people swimming. But in the spring and fall, when it's not so much attracting people, it could be a great spot for attracting birds. Again, sandy gravel, not a common feature out here. Even on the mainland, it's not a common feature. So it tends to attract shorebirds and things like that. But one of the neat things about it, next slide, Jim, is sometimes a fallout, what us birders call a fallout, is when there's inclement weather. And it was a great night for migration, let's say. And all of a sudden, these massive storms came in, heavy rains, and put all these birds down. And they put down where they were. And they're hungry. They've been migrating. They're looking for food. And sometimes they end up like this on those beaches. And I'm going to show you a number of slides from an event that happened in 2000 when there was a specific storm that dropped a lot of warblers, which are basically usually found in the trees and the scrub and stuff. But here they were looking for things like sand fleas and other insects on the beach that day. And just to point it out, yellow warbler, I'm going to start the left and work my way around clockwise. Yellow warbler, yellow warbler, yellow warbler, black-throated green warbler, American redstart. Right there in that picture. So, next slide. And here's a yellow warbler that has grabbed a little tidbit. So to help it survive. And because they're so tired and hungry, their focus has to be on survival. They need energy. So even if people are around, they have to trust that those people are going to leave them alone and let them focus on what they're doing. Next slide. And here's a male black-throated blue and a male American redstart on the right. And again, these are warblers. They shouldn't be in seaweed and things like that. But they're so hungry that they need to do what they need to do. Next slide. Or how about this American redstart that's actually out on the water? It's so tired. This is where it's just resting for right now until it probably can get a little bit of rest and then get to land where it can then look for food. Next slide, please. Or these warblers that have climbed into the rocks to feel a little safer while they need to sleep. And that's a hooded warbler on the top and a northern prula on the lower left. Hiding. You see a little bit of the green back on that prula, a little bit of yellow in the throat. Most that white on the tail of the hooded warbler. Next slide. And here's Jeff Dennis, who took all these slides, actually helping a bay-breasted warbler out. So they're that hungry, they just want food so that they can survive. And many times, the sad thing is, it can be an incredible experience for birders, but an event like that means there's a lot of birds that didn't make it. So appreciate what has made it and take that forward with you. Next slide, please. And now look here. Here's his feet. That's I'll start on the left. Black and white warbler, far left with all the streaking. Black-throated blue, almost straight above him. Yellow warbler, bay-breasted, way up at the top. And a black-throated green, like between his feet. Next slide. And how about this one? What better place to hide from a predator than under somebody's knee? So, aren't they adorable, though? Little black-throated green warbler. Next slide. And then, so continuing on, as you're moving your way through town, check out Wharton Avenue, and a little cul-de-sac, and its views of the rocks along the harbor. It's a great spot for gulls to roost. And herring gulls and great blackback gulls are always going to make up the large majority of gulls that you get out here. But gull species will roost together, so you want to look through them for what else you might see. Next slide, Jim. Like this lesser blackback gull. Notice the yellow legs. Great blackback gulls don't have yellow legs. Theirs are pink to flesh, to even grayish kind of color. So that bird stands out. Next slide. Or a rare king eider that shows up, and there's only ever been a few records of king eider. Again, a more northern species that this is about their southern range, so they would most be expected in the winter time. So late fall through early spring. But picking one out sometimes if they're mixed in with common eiders, which are very common, appropriately named, can be very difficult. Next slide. Jim. perhaps mostly in the spring for the orioles. You put out fruit and they will come to it. And this is an orchard oriole coming in. Next slide, Jim. Here you can compare Baltimore oriole on the left or a male, adult male orchard oriole on the right. Next slide, Jim. Or maybe you want to see a few more Baltimore orioles. Next slide, Jim.
That's Tom Martin.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That was Tom Martin putting those out. Yeah, it hits you. For anybody who's birded here for a lot of years and experienced Tom Martin, whose place was basically across from the general store. Every time you went through town, you had to have a few words with Tom to either know what was in his yard, because he would just scatter seed everywhere, and there'd be, I'll share lobster traps in a minute, but seed, and the birds, there would be birds, so you always had to stop in and he would attract lots. But check out this event at Donna Cundy's feeders. That's just a few orioles in that photo. You can see they're scattered all along the platform feeder, all through the trees. This one's an orchard oriole way up there. Most of these are Baltimore orioles. There's another orchard oriole there, but just a real feast for the eyes. So, yeah, I hope you all get to experience something like that. Even seeing one Baltimore oriole is a treat. Seeing this many at one time is really incredible. So, Jim, next slide. And sometimes you'll get those birds that you don't expect to show up at a feeder, let alone a fruit like this. These are a couple of warblers, northern parula, which is actually a bird that does nest here on the island. They make nests in the usnea, the lichen that hangs in the trees. Uncommon nester, but you don't really expect to see them coming in. They're mostly insect eaters coming in, but if they're very hungry, they're going to take what they can get. And what a great chance to see them. I pointed out that said look for that green spot on their back on that other one. You can barely see here. It's a little bit more obvious than the other one. Next slide. And of course, pheasants have a story of their own on the island. They were first introduced about 1937 when a whole bunch were brought out to the island. At the time, it was more or less meant they were doing it across the state for hunting to inspire people to do game hunting for pheasants and stuff like that. And there was at least one person on the island who was against it at the time. And so there was enough confusion between that person and other people on the island about whether hunting on Monhegan was allowed. So nobody ever really did it, and the pheasants just kept on going. And so they're still here. There's been numbers of releases since that early release. Some years are good for them, other years not so much. My guess is there's probably 15 to 20 on the island right now.
No, way more. There's like 15 in my yard.
So they've been increasing over the last few years greatly.
There's like 100.
Is it really? Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So again, another change. I got to revise the book. But they're great to have around. But it's an introduced species, so it's not one you would say, oh, that's a bird native to Monhegan. No, that was brought here, and they're doing okay, and they're used to people, so they're likely to be here for a while. Next slide, Jim. And then Monhegan has a unique habitat that you will find along the coast of New England, but not very many other places besides that, and that's lobster traps. And you would think, well, how in the world can a lobster trap be a habitat for birds? Safety. It provides safety. Next slide, Jim. So birds can get in it, and they're protected from predators. Yellow warbler on the top, black-throated blue on the bottom, black and white top left. Next slide. Little common yellow throat. So, next slide. White crowned sparrow. And these again these pictures are all from Jeff Dennis. Next slide. Blue grosbeak, which is an uncommon bird out here, taking advantage of it. Next slide. Taking advantage of it so much they feel safe enough to just get in there and sleep. Here's a mourning warbler sleeping inside the lobster trap. Next slide. Or even nesting. What a great place to put a nest. Mourning dove nesting in a lobster trap. Next slide. And not to be outdone, how about this orchard oriole, male orchard oriole, hiding amongst all the colorful buoys? A predator's not gonna notice it when it's a jumble of colors like that. So it's just a great spot for it to be. So again, things that are special about Monhegan that you just aren't going to get someplace else. Next slide. And then we get down to Lobster Cove, and it opens up to the expanse of the ocean. And Lobster Cove has its own special birds you want to look for. Next slide. The cove itself can be great for things like common eiders, double-crested cormorants coming right into it. Next slide. This little area off to the left, so this is the cove here. This is a little wet meadow that is a unique habitat, and it's one of the best spots to see some of the sparrows that are known for being in wet meadows, like Nelson sparrow or salt marsh sparrow, or things like marsh wren, sedge wren, things like that. Next slide. And then the point itself, Lobster Point, is just a great sea watching spot. South end of the island, a lot of things are passing by. Next slide, Jim. Of course, common eiders, which nest right here, can be a great spot to see them, sometimes in huge numbers in the non-breeding season. Next slide. Or maybe later in the season, right through the winter into spring, great cormorant, which arrive. Much fewer numbers than the very common double-crested cormorant. Notice that white patch at the base of that bill there. Next slide. Or potentially least sandpiper down in the sandy gravel at the inner part of Lobster Cove. And maybe on the rocks, next slide, Jim, a spotted sandpiper. Again, that's the best spot for me to get either one of those species. And the only other spot you might see, some of these might be the ice pond, or if you're lucky in the meadow, if you can see through it. But those little habitats can be so important. Next slide. And then, of course, the island opens up through the trails of the Monhegan Associates. Here's the entrance to the Underhill Trail. Next slide. Habitats change from that deciduous scrub more to the south to the northern part of the island, which is very much spruce and fir, evergreen trees. This is the Red Ribbon Trail. Next slide. Or potentially the Evergreen Trail, and the different bird species that you're likely to encounter in those habitats. Next slide. Like this red-breasted nuthatch, looking for food in the cones. Next slide. And there's a couple species that are what most of us consider winter finches in most of the parts of the states, but up here, they're eruptive species, meaning they, depending on their food sources, the whole population is kind of nomadic, and they go wherever the food is. So it's not so much a north-south migration every year. It could be east-west, depending on food. And they'll get out here on the island, and even if it's the middle of winter, if the food crop is great, they may nest. At the worst time of the year, you would think, but they may nest. And they might be here for 8 months or so, and then completely disappear. It all depends on the food crop. And this is a red crossbill. Next slide. And you might see a white-winged crossbill, and those are the two crossbill species that we have. Next slide. And then you get out to the headlands and the great views. So this is Whitehead. Next slide. Or maybe you get to Burnt Head. And of course, you're looking for water birds again. Maybe there's shearwater skimming the waves out there. Maybe there's whales going by. Next slide. Maybe there's a peregrine falcon that's zipping by looking for food, or just on its way south. That's a bird that doesn't mind water at all, and they will travel a lot of miles out over open water. Very powerful flyer. Next slide. And now I'm just going to run through a few more of the beautiful birds that you might encounter. I can't cover them all, but how about this green-winged teal, female green-winged teal? That you can see just that little patch of the green. If it was to fly, you'd really notice that the green patch. But an uncommon migrant, again, ice pond is where you're likely to have this bird show up. Next slide. Or maybe a skulking yellow-billed cuckoo, which will hide in the trees a lot. They don't move a lot. And they tend not to call unless they're on the breeding ground. So you have to kind of be lucky to see a yellow-billed cuckoo. And a lot of times they're looking for caterpillars and things like that to eat. So if they get in a right tree that has a lot of food, they'll just be moving around, not making any noise. But hopefully there's another birder that already spotted it for you and said, get over here. I've got a yellow-billed cuckoo. That's the best way to find them. Next slide. Or maybe a little ruby-throated hummingbird, which we get a fair number of out here on the island. Next slide. How about a common nighthawk, which is decidedly not common? and it's a species that is in decline. Your best chance to see this is kind of late summer, early fall, just before dusk when they come out and they're looking for basically hawking. It's not a hawk, even though it's called a night hawk, but it's like a overgrown flycatcher that's out hawking insects at dusk. And oftentimes they will just roost in a tree during the day, and if you're lucky, they blend right in. When those wings are folded, you can't see those white stripes so easy, they blend right in. But every now and then somebody's lucky enough to spot one, and you can get a good look at one perched, but usually you just see them flying around chasing insects. Next slide. How about a semi-palmated sandpiper? This little cutie. Again, you're most likely to see this at the ice pond or maybe the meadow, but most often they're heard as they're calling as they're flying overhead.
That's a plover.
Oh, did I? Yes, it is. I wrote the wrong name on there. Sorry. Thank you very much. That is a semi-palmated plover. So there is a semi-palmated sandpiper, and I must have been thinking about sandpipers when I typed that. Thank you. But same applies. Ice pond, meadow, but usually heard calling as they're flying over. And even though he's got a little bit of gook on his feet, I was going to say semi-palmated. The reason they get the name semi-palmated is because between their toes they have a little bit of a web between toes. It's not full, else it wouldn't be semi-palmated, would it? It'd be fully palmated. But you can't really see it because he's got algae or whatever on his feet. Next slide. Or a beautiful merlin. Again, we often see them flying around the island chasing dragonflies or small songbirds. Next slide. Owls, which is not a species most people would expect to see on Monhegan, and one you're not likely to encounter. This is a great horned owl. You can tell that just by its silhouette, by those ear tufts, which are not actually ears. They're just tufts that help elongate them. The ears are actually hidden on the side of their heads. But you can hear them calling, especially would be kind of late winter, early spring, and although breeding has not been confirmed, male calling and a female answering is a general indication that there might be breeding occurring. And Donna Cundy took this photo and has had them several years out behind her place. So, next slide. Or a very uncommon snowy owl, which shows up some winters out here on the island, and it's just a beauty to see. So, yeah. Next slide. Red-bellied woodpecker. So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, very uncommon. Today, a little bit more common. They're one of those species that's taken advantage of warming temperatures, and their range is expanding northward, and they're pushing into Maine, and they're getting to be much more reliable. Next slide. Chimney swift, another one of those little insect ones that is very uncommon on the island. Next slide. A few flycatchers, eastern wood pewee, and all these are often going to be seen either in trees or on perches looking for a meal to go out and catch and then take it back to a tree to eat. Next slide. Or this willow flycatcher, which is very uncommon. Older flycatcher, its close cousin is more expected. Willow is much more uncommon. Next slide. Or maybe an olive-sided flycatcher with that vested look. And if you hear them singing in the spring, they say, "Quick, 3 beers. Quick, 3 beers." So, next slide. I'm not going to do a whole show on bird calls. Red-eyed vireo. This is one of those birds that in migration, if you hit it just right and there's a fallout, you could see several hundred in a day if you're very lucky. Like the peak number, I think, is like 380 some in a day out here. But a beautiful little songbird with that line through the eye and line just above the eye and that beautiful green coloration in their back and wings. Next slide. Or how about this cute Philadelphia vireo? Much more uncommon than that red-eyed vireo, but to be expected if you're out much in the fall as they come through. Next slide. Or how about the blue jay, which so many of us birders, I think, take for granted, but they are just so beautiful. Never get tired of looking at those. Next slide. Little blue-gray gnatcatcher has a high, buzzy, thin little call, very active. Yeah, he's kind of the busybody in the tree if you get one. Very, very active, even more active than many of the warblers. That nice dark tail with the outer white tail feathers can be a great feature, and that white eye ring. Next slide. Or cedar waxwings. And often the best way to encounter them is, and they really do flock, so you'll see small flocks, maybe 20, 30 flying together. early in the morning, they're zipping around the island looking for a place to come down and feed, and then they find these mountain ash berries, which are very common in many parts of the island, and they'll just come into a tree, numbers of them, and just start to feast on the berries. This happens to be a young bird. You can tell by that streaking on it. Yeah, having a little fun eating a berry. Next slide. Or how about the beautiful male purple finch? This is another one of those eruptive species that show up in numbers some years, other years almost none, if any. And then some years you can just see hundreds of them. But a great bird to have around. Next slide. Or a very uncommon evening grosbeak, another one of those winter finches as we call them. Look at the size of that bill, great for opening seeds. So, next slide. Or a couple sparrows species, white-crowned sparrow, I showed you one before. Here's another great look at one. There was a day back in, actually several days back in 1997, I believe. Next slide, Jim. When white-crowned sparrows and dark-eyed juncos just literally covered this island. Jeff Dennis figured there was 3,000 plus white-crowned sparrows and 5,000 plus dark-eyed juncos out here during that time period. So, just amazing. Next slide. Or the cute little swamp sparrow, which you're likely to hear calling from in the meadow. And if you're lucky, it pops up on one of the reeds and you get a look at it. Next slide. And just a few warblers to run through. One of the favorites of all the birders that come out, ovenbird with a snack in its mouth. Next slide. Or a male American red star. And just a palette of colors. If you're an artist, how can you not love warblers? They come in all the different colors. Next slide. Black and white warbler used to be called the black and white creeper because of the way it feeds, walking along, creeping along the tree trunks. Next slide. Or a rare blue-winged warbler. Next slide. How about this yellow warbler trying to hide? It's hard to even see it in that forsythia. Next slide. Black-throated blue warblers are a favorite of mine. You don't see a lot of them, but they're just quite distinctive when you do. Look at that little handkerchief white patch on its wing. It looks like it has a handkerchief tucked into a pocket. Next slide. Or how about this male black-throated blue? See all those little insects that it's up fly catching? Next slide. Or how about this beautiful black-throated blue eating a berry? So they are just wonderful to see. And in the fall, when you get the foliage colors like you do, just incredible. Next slide. Or a chestnut-sided warbler. In the fall, no chestnut-sided. Next slide. And here's that blackpoll warbler. This is a fall blackpoll warbler. In the spring, the males are very black on the top, white underneath, a nice cap, black cap on the head. But in the fall, they look like this. And this is that bird that makes that amazing flight out over the ocean. Next slide. Or a Cape May warbler, a boreal species that you're most likely to encounter in the spruces. Some years, quite a few. Other years, almost none. Next slide. Or a singing common yellowthroat, one of the resident birds out here on the island in the meadow and other wet areas. Just a great, beautiful bird with that black mask. Next slide. Or a black-throated green warbler. We met him a little earlier in the talk. Next slide. Or a rare orange-crowned warbler. This is one that birders would love to encounter out here, but it's later in the season, so oftentimes you need to arrive like October. And many of the birders are here for the bigger numbers, maybe at the end of September, and may miss out on orange-crowned warbler. So timing can really play a big role. Next slide. Or a prairie warbler, a more southern species that makes it just up to Monhegan about. Next slide. Or a hooded warbler, again, a hungry bird that's really not supposed to be hiding under buildings or anywhere near buildings. Next slide. Or a mourning warbler. Just the incredible colors and the differences are just striking. Next slide. Or palm warbler, a fairly common bird that we get out here. Next slide. And even the warblers are excited about being on Monhegan. That shot was taken by Luke Seitz. I do want to point out all the slides that you're seeing tonight and all the ones in the book were all taking on Monhegan. There's not species slides that were inserted just because it was a great slide. All of them were taken on Monhegan. So, next slide. Or Canada warbler. Another bird that don't see in very large numbers. Next. Or a Wilson's warbler. Again, with a little meal. That's why they're here. Great little beret on top of a Wilson's warbler. Next slide. And then just a few of the more unexpected or uncommon or like the scarlet tanager, just unbelievable birds for their coloration. Next slide. Or northern cardinal. Again, one of those birds we just take for granted. It's a resident out here and fairly common, but just a great bird to have. Next slide. How about this leucistic ruby crown kinglet? Ruby crown kinglets don't look like this, but it has a pigment problem, and it looks more coffee colored than it does the way it should. Next slide. Or blue grosbeak. So now I'm just going to show you a couple birds. Again, why birders love Monhegan, the rarity, they're the uncommon birds. These are birds of the west and the south that really probably shouldn't be here, but show up almost every year. Blue grosbeak. Next slide. Summer tanager in the spring. Again, a bird from the south and the west. Next slide. Western kingbird. Over 40 records of western kingbird. That bird should be out towards the Rockies on the Great Plains. Should not be here on Monhegan. Next slide. Lark sparrow. Every year you're likely to see one or more lark sparrows here. Again, should be out Colorado. Those areas should not be here in the east. Next slide. Clay-colored sparrow, I mentioned that one. They have become a little more common, but again, a bird from the Midwest, not a bird from the east. Next slide. Dick thistle, a bird of the south. Again, shows up here every year on Monhegan. This is a bird that you're more likely to hear its unusual call. I can't even really imitate them. Raspberry call, they call it, as it flies overhead, then actually see it. Next slide. Yellow-headed blackbird. Again, bird of the Midwest. Shouldn't really be here. Next slide. Sandhill crane. There's only ever been 3 records on Monhegan. Next slide. Short-eared owl. 5 records for Monhegan. Next slide. Golden-winged warbler. I think there's been 12 records for Monhegan. This is very much a bird that's in serious decline. It likes early successional deciduous growth to nest in, and we're losing a lot of that habitat across the east. Next slide. There's an interesting one. Lawrence's warbler. You might not find that in some of your guides. That's a hybrid between blue-winged warbler and golden-winged warbler that has a unique look. And there's only ever been, I think, 3 records on the island for Lawrence's. Next slide. Or Townsend's warbler, a bird you should be seeing out on the Rockies or Washington State. There's been 3 records on Monhegan and Townsend's. Next slide. White-winged dove, been over, I think, 10 records now of white-winged dove. Shows up at Donna Cundy's feeders sometimes and stuff. Again, bird of the south and west. Next slide. Cattle egret. Again, I think 8 records. Cattle egret. Next slide. And snowy egret. 12 records. Again, beautiful birds. Yeah, smaller than the snowy and much smaller than great egret. Yeah. And then these are southern wanderers that kind of, after breeding, kind of wander up this way often. Next slide. Blackback woodpecker, a bird that you would expect to see on the mainland, but it has made it out here 8 times. They don't really migrate, they don't wander too much, and they don't like water. So the fact that it's been out here 8 times is interesting. Next slide. Painted bunting, again, a bird of the south and west. How is that for color? Eye-popping. 5 times on Monhegan. Next slide. How about the subtle Say's phoebe? 8 times on Monhegan. Next slide. And now here's just the last couple to wind it up of real unexpected. Black-headed grosbeak, 3 times. I expect to see them when I'm in Arizona, not when you're in Maine. Next slide. Ivory gull. There's only ever been 2 records for the island. Next slide. Gray flycatcher. This is one of those that it's only 1 record, and it's the only one ever in Maine. And next slide. Same thing with Cassin's virium. Again, just lucky that people were here and were able to identify it and pass the word, so a number of people got to see it. And let's finish it off with, next slide, Virginia's warbler. So this is that's again a bird of the Rockies and the West that is rare anywhere across the entire East, and it's been on Monhegan 4 times. Nowhere else in Maine, nowhere else in many of the other states, and yet it's been seen here 4 times. So just amazing. So, and next slide. And I want to thank you for coming. I need to thank a number of the photographers, and those are the ones whose pictures were included in tonight's, beside my own but a number of others who contributed to the book and the fabulous photos. It wouldn't be what it is without their photos, and they're so generous in sharing. I'd like to thank all the birders who ever contributed their sightings, whether it's way in the past or whether it's now. We're still adding so much. Like I said, since I published the book last fall, 2 new species have been added to the island since then. So don't tell my wife, but I have to do a revision already of the book. But it's always, do a supplement. It's always changing. But get out there, see the birds, take it with you, conserve nature, and let's keep it going. So, next slide. I may have gone over my hour by a couple minutes. So, Hammond's flycatcher and mountain bluebird, which was the 3rd record for Maine, first ever for Monhegan. So, yeah.
You showed a couple of photos. I think one was an oriole hiding amongst some.
The buoys.
They don't really do that. I mean, it's just by chance, right?
That was by chance, yes. But that bird was so tired, and it felt that was a good spot to rest.
But you think it was aware of the bright colors?
I don't know if it was aware, but it fit in perfectly.
Yeah.
So, and if it's gonna,
Great photo.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know exactly. I mean, definitely the lobster traps. They're going in there specifically because it's an isolated spot. They don't have to worry about cats. They don't have to worry about hawks, any of that stuff. So it's a definite conscious choice to do that.
So the lobster traps are not death traps for that?
No, not at all. They're life traps. And Tom used to go over and just sprinkle the seed all over in the lobster traps. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Not really about the birds.
Yeah.
Are there many places open, available to stay during, say,
On
the
Monhegan?
fall for-
Yeah, well, at least through September. Island Inn is open through Columbus Day weekend. And then there are some of the guest houses, Trailing U, and stuff like that, and some of those that will be open later, right through October into November. Some of them, shining sails and stuff, So there are opportunities. Yeah. Any other questions? If anybody, this is my promo. If anybody doesn't have a copy and would like one, I do have some here, and I'd be happy to sign it for anybody that does. I do have a pen, so I'd be happy to do that. But most importantly, if you have some sightings, report them. Let me know. I'll give you my card. I want to know what you see it. But any other last questions? Yeah.
So you talked a fair bit about the pheasants. Are
Yes.
they the only sort of like game fowl on Monhegan?
Great question. Yes. Ruffed grouse, I think there's 2 or 3 records. In fact, Tom Martin found ruffed grouse feathers once, so it was obviously something that had already grabbed it and eaten it, and he found the feathers. And I think one other live one was seen. Well, that's interesting. Doug had mentioned that, the turkey feathers, and I don't know the story behind that. So it was around Thanksgiving, so somebody was wondering, somebody had somehow gotten a turkey somewhere, plucked it and just threw the feathers or I don't know. That I would like to know more about. Was that actual turkey that made it out here or not?
Well, we have a lot of wild turkeys around Booth Bay.
And they're expanding. Yeah,
they're
very
doing
much
well.
so. Very much they're becoming more common.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Because there aren't any deer anymore, has that changed anything?
I don't want to speak for the Monhegan Associates, but it's definitely changed things greatly. And I know they've had a lot of... So the deer changed things in a negative way because of their browsing. And it was right at a time when certain invasive species like barberry were taking over for native. So they browsed all this native habitat. And what came back was not the native habitat. It was some of those invasive species, which then became very prevalent across the island. And that's one of those never-ending jobs, removing invasives. We do it down in Cape May, where I'm from. It's English ivy, it's mugwort, and you can remove it, and a couple years later you're removing it again, and it's a constant battle. But yes, they had a distinct bad impact on the habitat because of their browsing.
But are there different birds that come because there aren't the deer, or are you seeing?
No, I don't think, it's more just that specific plants that they removed or
Right.
changed.
Okay.
So it would definitely open up some areas, so there might be species of, some of the songbirds that like more open areas that might be more prone to be seen.
Okay.
But yeah, the tick situation with the deers was the thing that really led to their removal and stuff, but that was good too. Anytime you introduce a new animal to an ecosystem, it can throw everything out of whack.
Are there birds that eat ticks?
So there are birds that eat ticks, but the most famous thing that eats ticks is possums. Possums love to eat ticks, but there are birds that will eat ticks as well. Yeah. And
Guinea hens eat ticks.
what's that? Guinea hens?
hens.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
So what's known about the navigation capabilities of the birds? Do they actually like aim at Monhegan Island like a pilot would aim from New York City?
So it's possible. It varies so much between species, and I don't know that studies have shown it specifically for Monhegan, but I'm just going to take an example I know very well about, and that's brant. And brant is a species of goose. You can see them out here on Monhegan, not often, but brant, which are nesting up on the tundra up in the Arctic and stuff, head south, and most of the population spends their winters on the East Coast, New Jersey, Virginia, places like that, eating eelgrass and stuff. But they follow specific routes that take them through some of the Great Lakes, and they actually look for specific rivers, and they'll make like a 90-degree turn at that river. They'll come along Lake Ontario, heading straight east, following the South Shore, and they'll get to like the Genesee River, and boom, it's a 90-degree turn, and they follow that river course right down. And the Susquehanna has been shown to be a great route. They jump from Lake Ontario to the Finger Lakes, like Cayuga Lake, and then to the Susquehanna River, and they follow that river right down to the ocean. So they're following specific geographic
Markers,
keys. Yes, and the species know to do that. Yeah, birds are amazing, and they're so. As much as we know, we don't know the half of it. We're still learning so much about birds. Yeah.
Is there concern about wind turbines?
So yes, that is a tough question. So we're dealing with it big time in New Jersey right now. Wind turbines are always going to kill birds. There's nothing we can do, although there's steps being taken, and certain research is showing that painting or coloring one blade of it changes it, or emitting UV rays, lights from them. They're doing that with buildings more now, and testing that to keep birds from collisions with buildings, which is a huge problem as well.
Yeah, also a friend of mine from college, he runs a company and they set up arrays of cameras, and the cameras use AI to detect the birds, and then they actually are required by law when the birds are within a certain distance of the turbines
shut
to
it
stop
down.
the turbines.
Yeah, so they're getting to that point. The biggest argument for wind turbines, despite the killing of birds, is that the fossil fuels are killing more birds every year than those wind turbines are ever going to. The wind turbines happen to be an obvious thing to point at and say, that blade killed that bird. The fossil fuels are, we've lost 2.9 billion birds since the 70s. 2.9 billion. One in every 4 birds since the 70s. So that old saying, it's not like it used to be. With birds, it's true. There are that many less birds in the world than there used to be, and that's habitat loss, but changing climate is just killing birds. And wind turbines and solar are a way to harness energy that we need. The problem is we need the energy. How are we going to harness the energy that is an appropriate way, knowing that we need it, that's going to kill less birds than the alternative? So it's a lesser evil versus and sighting is so important. And one of the things, so friends of mine that own a company called Cellular Tracking Technologies, they're developing GPS trackers and putting them on eagles, and they've got them small enough they're putting them on monarch butterflies. And you can track them with GPS and stuff. What they've been able to indicate is tracking some of these birds down certain mountain ridges. They find that the birds are using a certain part of the ridge and not the other. If you put the wind turbine on that part of the ridge instead of this part of the ridge, you're killing so many fewer birds. It's a matter of making sure that the wind turbine companies understand you have to consider this. They have to be sited properly and go from there. Yeah.
You can even solar kill birds too. And
Well, it can in a different way. Part of solar's problem is, again, similar to fossil fuels in that in order to get the materials to make the solar panels, you're doing some mining and stuff like that. But after that, it's a much better way if they're placed properly. Again, if you're not destroying habitat to put up solar farms, but instead you're using industrial sites that aren't being used for anything else anymore, and they're just making, then that's a great way to go. And people having them on their roofs and stuff, and providing your own electricity for your house in a way that's not affecting nature so much is wonderful.
How
Yeah.
does the fossil fuels kill the birds?
So carbon dioxide
Okay.
levels, warming temperature, more particles in the air, so loss of air quality. But it's plant degradation as well. It's actually we don't talk about it so
thinking
much.
about the cars going along hitting birds and things.
Well, cars going along hitting birds is out, but again, you're not ever gonna be able to stop that. So you're not gonna get people to want to drive 10 miles an hour instead of 60, kind of thing.
And even if we all
so-
got in trains, then the trains would just.
Yeah. But like bigger storms, and storms kill tons. So more hurricanes, things like that, tornadoes. It's destroying habitat, and there's a lot of things with the warming climate that we haven't even seen yet. Water level rise. So that's wiping out colonies of seabirds because they've nested for hundreds of years on certain stretches of beaches, and the water level over the last 50 years has risen enough that now when a storm comes in and pushes that surge, we see it with black skimmers down in New Jersey, piping plovers, American oyster catchers. Those colonies are just getting wiped out. Yeah. And that's areas they've nested for decades. And now it's just a regular occurrence. They have to get lucky enough that they can get through a season without a storm hitting.
Thanks.
So, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.